Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title, today I am reviewing the second entry in the Indiana Jones series. First, if you go chronologically, of course, and that is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. As you can tell from this, it's my newer VHS copy of the film. Like with the first one, I have an older copy up there somewhere. But since this was a newer one, I'm like, it's probably going to be in better condition. Like with the Raiders, I did watch it on Netflix. And watching it back, the film looks excellent in HD. And it is a film that holds up. And I have to say, just from an entertainment standpoint, I did enjoy it more than Raiders. I might have to watch it a couple times to actually end up liking it a bit more. But entertainment-wise, I definitely enjoyed Temple more. And I think that might be part of the reason why, as a kid, I ended up watching Temple more than Raiders. Like, I would still watch Raiders, but it was mainly like if I was marathoning all three, or if I was in the mood more for the digging in the wrong place. This one just has more of that spectacle entertainment value about it, so I think that's why I watched it more. The film was released in May of 1984, produced on a budget of approximately $28 million. It would go on to garner about $333 million worldwide. 179 of that was in the US, so that's a pretty good gross. Now, the film is darker than its predecessor, which is by design. Just like with Star Wars, George was like, well, we're going to have to make this one darker. And he did succeed. Definitely does feel darker than the previous one. Although it seems in later years, George and Steven Spielberg, who also directed this film like he did with the first one, have regretted making it darker, either feeling that it went darker than they intended, or they just didn't feel that it should have been as dark. Part of it was that at the time that they were making this movie, they were in the wrong state of mind. I know George was going through his divorce that everyone talks about, that also was kind of affecting him when they were doing Return of the Jedi, or he just finished with all that. And usually when you're going through divorce, even if it's amicable, you can be in a dark state of mind, and if you create, it's going to be shown in your creations. Like some of the poetry I wrote years ago when I was in a kind of dark state of mind, you can kind of tell it's there, but it's not super dark, it's just very emotional. Some of myself is in that. And another piece of art that comes to mind that is darker than his predecessor and is affected by the mindset of one of it is the Iron Maiden album, The X Factor. Not only is it darker because of the fact that Blaze Bayley has a lower voice than Bruce did, but also that Steve Harris, the principal songwriter and bass player, was also going through a divorce at that same time, so his mindset was jaded by it, which you can definitely tell on some of the songs, more specifically 2 a.m. I mean, just listen to some of those lyrics. I get in from work at 2 a.m. and sit down with a beer, turn on late night TV, and then I wonder why I'm here. Here I am again, look at me again, here I am again on my own, trying hard to see what there is for me, here I am again on my own. Lyrics like that, you could tell he was in a dark state of mind. This film, for Lucas and Spielberg, is that equivalent. You just look up at the screen and you're like, wow. And part of that darkness is what led to the creation of the PG-13 rating when combined with Gremlins. It went into effect a few weeks after this, if I remember right. But just the heart scene alone, which I will talk about in due time, that alone you can see why the MPA was eventually like, you know what? We probably should put another thing here, because the ratings go from G, PG to R. With PG, there's a lot of gray area in there. And part of that is because of a lot of parents going, oh, PG, that means the kids can watch it, babysitter. And then when they find out, oh, what happened to the film? Oh, this guy's got his heart ripped out. What? Which leads to the parents going, think about the children. Yeah, blame the movie studio instead of doing the research yourself. With a lot of the scenes, Spielberg was a little uncomfortable while filming them, and he tried to add some levity to it, like the fight scene later on in the film. A hammer gets thrown and bonks one of the background guys on the head, so it's like, a little joke there. It doesn't change the tone too much, but it adds a little bit of levity in a darker scene. And he also, in '89, had something to say about the film, so I gotta go to my notes for this, because I want to get this quote exact. And this is what he said. I wasn't happy with Temple of Doom at all. It was too dark, too subterranean, and much too horrific. I thought it out-poltered Poltergeist. There's not an ounce of my own personal feeling in Temple of Doom. I wouldn't go that far with Spielberg. I mean, you don't have a lot of his usual touches in the film. If you watch enough of Spielberg's films, you usually can see his usual touches. There's a lot of motifs he uses, like broken family. You'll see that in E.T. amongst other ones. Ways he constructs the film. With this one, I'd say there's a handful of moments in the film where you can definitely tell he was the director. Like how he shoots the opening musical number, how he handles the scenes with action in them. You can definitely tell he's behind the camera. The rest of it, though, you can definitely tell he's there, but it's not the usual film that he would do. But I think that works for the film's benefit, because you watch it like, Spielberg did this? This is not his usual flair. Good on you. It's like when you watch a Tim Burton movie, but it doesn't have all of his usual motifs in it throughout the entire movie. Although I haven't watched it, I hear Ed Wood is one of his better movies. I mean, it was early on, but Pee-wee's Big Adventure, you can definitely tell it has some of his motifs in it, but not all of them. Of course, Batman '89 also has a couple of them, but he didn't have as much creative control on that one as he did on Batman Returns. And half of Big Fish, the part where it's not the stories, feels more normal. And then he goes all Burton-y when he does the tall tales. And it works to the film's advantage. Because you're like, alright, okay, so this is actually happening. This is the tall tale. With Temple of Doom, because of this little split between Spielberg and the tone, you get that dark tone, but you also still get that feeling of it being an action-adventure serial tribute like the first film was. So it's kind of a nice little flip where you got to get the balance right, and to me it works. Spielberg himself, since he wasn't in the right frame of mind when he was shooting it, I can understand why he would have that feeling of self-effacement about it, where he's like, but looking from the outside at it, I feel he doesn't really have anything to apologize for when it comes to the tone. Now, the plot of the film is that it takes place in 1935, so about a year before the previous film, which, if you did not see that opening little credit that says Shanghai 1935, you would be forgiven for thinking that this one takes place after Raiders. Like, I did not know that until years later. I'm like, oh, this is a prequel? Oh. Because the film carries on, like, this could have been before, could have been after, and they never mentioned the war, so that could be the big hint that it's probably beforehand, but they don't really mention World War II in the first film either, other than the Nazi parties around, which I did go back and look it up. They are digging in Egypt, so that little thing I was wondering about, like, shouldn't the British Army be here, is accurate. So the fact that the Nazi party officials were digging with impunity in a territory normally controlled by Great Britain is like, yeah. Which in this film they do kind of address something like that. It's like, shouldn't there be some British military presence around here if something's going on in this? Which there is. They only show up in a couple scenes, but they're there, so applaud them for actually putting that in. But without that little time thing, you could watch this film, and it'd be kind of a floating little time period, kind of like how the James Bond films are, where the more earlier ones, there's like a loose continuity where they might mention certain things in another film, or bring it up, but it's not like strict continuity where follow. And part of that is like, you'd be wondering, like, where's Marion? The end of the previous film made it seem like they were going to be together, and all of a sudden he's hooking up with this Willie girl? Where's Marion? Then we realized the prequel's like, oh, it's before, so that means sometimes between this film and the first one, him and Willie split, which, as you watch the film, you're like, I could see that. And he ended up back with Marion, which they actually do have chemistry there, because they're old flames. And then, of course, then when you watch the third one, you're like, oh, I guess something happened with him and Marion. I guess it's just like James Bond. They get together at the end of the film, and then by the next film, they're split up for some reason, which is fitting considering that James Bond is essentially Indiana Jones's spiritual father. And then, of course, in Last Crusade, with the casting of Sean Connery, he becomes his literal father. So they decided to go that route, and then they kind of explain it once they get to Crystal Skull, but I'll address that when I get to Crystal Skull. Now, it begins in Shanghai, just like with the first one. We follow that same little step, which that's one little motif that the first three films always have, is that the opening scene is a good action scene, and he introduces Indy and whoever's going to be hanging out with him, and it's usually disconnected from the main plot. Crystal Skull does do that, but it breaks it a little bit, but I'll address that when I get there. This one, we see Indy doing this job for a Chinese mobster, and he gets double-crossed, which is why Willie, who is a Shanghai singer and dancer, ends up with him, and we're introduced to his buddy Short Round, played by Jonathan Kwan in his first role, which this and the next film he did, Goonies, are the two films he's mainly known for, but he did do a handful of things other than that. The three of them end up in that plane with that famous scene where they jump out with a raft and they end up on a river, and they end up in India where they are approached by these villagers who tell them that their sacred stones have been taken along with their children, and they want them to go speak to the Maharaja to retrieve the stones. Of course, Indy's like, skeptical, which by the end of the film kind of creates a potential plot hole between this and the next film, because you're like, alright, if he sees supernatural elements exist here, why is he scoffing a little bit about the Ark of the Covenant? The only thing I can think of is maybe he doesn't truly believe the Ark exists, or maybe he believes it does, but doesn't actually believe it actually has supernatural powers, or if it does, it might not be what the texts say they are. It's one of those things, though. It's one of those little minor things, but that's the risk you get when you decide to do a prequel. And part of the reason they went the prequel route is because George was like, I don't think we could do the Nazis again so soon. Which, of course, he changed his mind by Last Crusade, but if you jump forward in time, you kind of still have to use them, unless you jump over a decade forward to where the Nazis are gone, and then it's like, okay, you either got to go with the Reds then, or you got to do hidden Nazis. Well, the group does end up at the palace. They do speak with the Maharaja. Him and his prime minister are like, oh, okay, everything's fine, everything's fine. But everything's not fine. Indy's almost killed by an assassin, they're almost killed by a trap, and they end up underground, which is where Spielberg's subterranean comment comes into play, which that part, yeah, but it goes with the plot. And they find the Thuggee cult, led by Mola Ram, who is the main antagonist of the film. He might not be that deep of a villain outside of his own personal motivations involving the resurrection of the cult, but his actor, oh, the presence he has, he does scream serial villain. Definitely a character that fits the whole action-adventure serial tribute motif that we have. He's kind of like the one lead Nazi from the previous film, where he's not the deepest villain, but the actor portraying him, you're like, oh, he's so good, he's so spot on. And of course, his little conversation with Indy and their little confrontation near the end, you're like, oh, this guy. And of course, his costume, that headdress, the makeup and all that, he's just a perfect villain for this type of movie. Of course, Indy and his friends have to get the stones, get out of there, destroy the cult, and of course, walk off into the sunset. That's the rest of the film, abridged, and it does make for an entertaining ride. And of course, before the end, literally, because we got that famous minecart chase scene. At the bridge scene, which is filmed in 3 different locations, filmed in the Everglades for the Crocs, filmed on location in Sri Lanka for the bridge part, and then filmed in the studio for the hanging part. And of course, everyone remembers Mola Ram ripping the man's heart out and then dropping him into fire and he burns. Ooh. So many moments in this film that are iconic, and a lot more that I can remember from childhood watching than from the previous film. And I think part of that is because they upped the spectacle with this, which some of them do lend to the darker tone of this film. While Lucas might have come up with the story, he did not write the screenplay, which is like, oh, thank God. As you guys know what I've said about Lucas, I think he's a good story man. I think he's a good idea person, but when it comes to writing screenplays, when he's doing it alone, he's not the best. I think with the original Star Wars, he got lucky, partially due to the people around him. You know, his then wife, Marsha Lucas, was one of the editors, so she was able to fix some of the story ideas in post. And then, of course, one of the screenwriters he had, Gloria Katz, was also a script doctor on the first Star Wars, so she helped him a little bit there. And she's also one of the screenwriters here. And the other one, of course, is William Hewick, if I'm pronouncing that name right. And they wrote the script together. They've collaborated a couple times after this. Their next big one was on Howard the Duck, a film I need to revisit one of these days, which, like these films, was a childhood favorite of mine. I got the DVD for it up there somewhere, so definitely be a down-the-road revisit. Much belated one, because I've had that DVD maybe like 3 years now, and I've been putting it off. Of course, Hewick also, he directed that one, he co-wrote it, and that was essentially his last big one. And Gloria did also work with George on American Graffiti, so both of them had that long-term relationship with George that seemed to have ended, at least when it comes to working on films in the early 90s, which makes me wonder, what kind of falling out did they have? That was it George's changing attitude in the years before he did the special editions and the prequels, or was it wanting to get new blood in there? We know he did with a certain person named Rick, who worked with him on both. So who knows? Maybe there was some political play there. You can't talk about the story of this film without addressing the one big criticism of it, and that is how it portrays Indian culture in the film. Which, by the way, is the main reason they had to film in Sri Lanka, because in order to film in India, the Indian government had to approve the script. They looked at it and they objected to it heavily because they felt it didn't reflect Indian culture, which is why they wanted the phrase Mahavaraja taken out. So they're like, oh, screw it, we'll just go film in Sri Lanka. And watching it back as an adult, I can see why. I don't know much about Indian culture other than knowing, where Buddhism and Hinduism began. Hinduism, one of the oldest religions that is still in practice. And just a little bit about the chakra natures and all that. That's really all I really know about it, other than Hindus, cows are sacred to them, so they don't eat them. The few Muslims who are of Indian descent that can't eat pork, which those two little things led to a certain rebellion when they were under British control. Not really a lot that I know about it in specifics, other than apparently because of dietary restrictions, there are a lot of people in India who are vegetarian, which is why the dinner scene would be objectionable to them, because you see these characters eating insects, eating snake weird things, the monkey brains. That one alone I can definitely see why, because eating monkey's brains, I mean, you're eating another primate. It's a little weird, although not unheard of, because chimpanzees will hunt and eat monkeys, so I guess it's accurate. But I think it's the whole fact that it's brain. If any of those monkeys had prions, you're screwed. And of course the snake bit. So I was like, I can definitely see why that'd be objectionable. And then of course the whole cult thing, worship of Kali. I can see why someone would be mad at that, because it's like, that's not fully accurate. However, the way it comes off in the film to me, and maybe this is just how I'm interpreting it, they're coming off more as individuals who are bastardizing the Indian, and I'm going to assume by the fact that they mention Kali and Shiva, Hindu culture rather than true practitioners. It's be the Indian/Hindu equivalent of Christians and Muslims who say they practice their faith accurately, but then they're essentially just super judgmental. This is more for the Christian side, obviously. They're the ones that are like, oh, what would Jesus do? And then judge everyone. Or, like the Westboro Baptist Church, go out there and picket, God hates fags, all those people. And then, of course, with the Muslim aspect, it'd be the ones that go out there, stone gays to death, extremist terrorists, all those things. They seem to be the more Hindu equivalent of that in the film. And of course, with Kali, I did do some light research. She is a goddess of death, but she's also a maternal figure. You don't get that part from here. And I think that's part of what Indy is getting at the very end when he's having his final confrontation with Mola Ram, when he's saying, you betrayed Shiva. Because Shiva is Kali's consort. They're a couple. And he's also apparently, if I read right, the patriarch of the whole Hindu pantheon. So essentially, by bastardizing Hinduism, he's betraying Shiva. And he's also bastardizing Shiva's wife, so another way to betray him. So, there's another little connection with my little analogy with Christianity. It's like they're cherry-picking aspects of their religion and playing those up and then throwing the other ones to the side and going on with that. Which is why I would describe them as a Kali cult and not true religious people. I know some people might try to point out, oh, you're doing a whole no true Scotsman fallacy, but to me they're coming off as people who are corrupting the religion that they're supposed to be practicing and not actually practicing it. Like Mola Ram could be, he probably actually does believe in the religion, or at least the power he gets from it, but he could be using it to control everyone else for his own good, because other than getting the remaining stones, he doesn't really have that deep of a motivation other than maybe freeing India from imperial control, which that part you can understand. But other than that, it's like, what's he going to do after that? Take over the world? Of course! I mean, it's an action-adventure serial. That's probably where his motivation goes. I mean, it's not like with it's like with the Nazis wanting to get the Ark and the Grail. It's like we all know what Hitler's probably going to do with it. I will take over the world. Good, 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 good. Another interesting thing is the actor who played the Indian shaman did not speak English while they were making the film, so he had to learn all of his lines phonetically, and part of it was Spielberg like giving him his lines off screen, which is why there seems to be a little awkwardness in the way he delivers his lines. The other Indian characters that speak both languages don't have that, and that's because they actually seem to be bilingual. It does add a little bit to how he's mysterious because he's a shaman, so it makes you wonder, is something from the other side speaking through him? One of those things the film brings up loosely but never addresses. The minecart sounds in that one scene that I brought up earlier, they were filmed at Disneyland in one of the roller coasters with all the actual sounds turned off. And it does add to it. I mean, you have to listen hard to hear to notice all the specific sounds, but it works. At one point when the film was beginning to go over budget, Spielberg and Lucas turned to Gloria and Willard, and they're like, we gotta save money somehow. You guys gotta figure this out. You guys are the writers. So they essentially just removed one page from the script and saved the production $1 million. And the scene that they took out was a biplane chase scene, which, watching the finished film, the only moment I can see where there would have been a biplane chase scene would have been before the famous raft chase. So that makes me wonder if that was a rewrite. I'd have to look more into it. Maybe they mentioned it in a commentary. But the good thing is that scene doesn't go to waste because it ends up being used in the next film. I just love it when they are able to do that. I mean, the Halloween film franchise is famous for that too. That famous desk chase scene from H2O was originally written for 4, and then they brought it back in a later film because Mustafa Akkad remembered it. While it didn't get as many nominations as the previous film did, because the previous film I think got at least 7 or 8 of them. I'm not looking at the list around there. This film got 2 nominations. It was nominated for score for John Williams, which is a shame he didn't win because overall I think his score here is better than his score in the first one. And he uses, of course, the motif that he wrote for the film a bit more here. Some might say it's a little overused, but I think it doesn't feel intrusive. It's not like the score from Creature of the Black Lagoon where they play it every time the creature shows up to the point where it's like, we get it, he's there. Be more subtle with your music. But the one he did win for is like well deserved, and that was best visual effects. Now there are a few moments where the matte lines are a bit there. It's in a charming way, and a lot of the effects still look good. I mean, the hand going through, the burning, the minecart scene, the plane crash, a lot of the stunt work involved around it all still look good. Of course, some of the things during the bridge scene, like you could tell a little bit, and part of it was how they had to integrate real alligators into the scene, where it's like, okay, they could have shown bodies, but they had to do it in a convincing way, so it meshes well together. There's a little awkwardness, but it adds to the charm of the film, and since this is, like I've said time and again, a tribute to the old B-movie serials, it fits. Harrison Ford does a great job as Indy. You definitely buy this as the same character we saw before, but underwent different experiences prior to what we saw him in the first film. Of course, there's a little thing about a potential plot hole between them, but there's enough wiggle room for the audience to be like, okay, maybe something else happened. Kate Capshaw as Willie, I thought she does a good job for what little she has to do. I don't really buy their relationship as much. I mean, there's that one scene where there's that tension where they're in rooms together, and the way that scene is edited, it's so fun to watch. But I think him and Marion are a better couple, but I think part of that is the backstory history of the two, and the way that the actors work off each other so well. You believe them as an old couple that is getting back together through the course of the film, whereas here, it seems like it's just going to be a one-night stand, and that's it. That's all I believe between the two of them, but it's enough to carry through the film. And of course, Short Round's line about "No time for love, Dr. Jones" does carry forward through a lot of the film, because unlike the first film, it's never implied that they actually do the deed during the course of the film other than a kiss. Of course, not really much time. The sad thing is that there's not really much to her character other than to stand there and look pretty. I mean, she does have some nice moments, like she punches one of the thugs, and she does sing pretty well, but she's essentially the archetypical damsel in distress, which is a feeling that she shared. The sad part about that, though, is when she went to go and promote the film on Johnny Carson, guess who made an appearance there as well? My old adversary, Siskel and Ebert, because as many of you know, I am not the biggest fan of those two critics. I ended up disagreeing with them a lot more than I agree with them, though there are times I do agree with them. I do agree with their assessment of the character, and I will disagree about how they handled their assessment of her performance. They called her performance whiny, when, if anything, they should say the character is whiny and her performance is just going with the character and it fits. Now, the fun thing about this is that since Kate was still on set, she's like, don't speak about it like I'm not here. Now, I haven't watched the footage, so I don't know if they were diplomatic on it, but if they weren't, bad move on your part, guys. You should go, all due respect to Miss Capshaw, the character she played, not a big fan of. That's how I would handle it, at least. Of course, Jonathan Kwan is short round, a good first performance. He does have an interesting chemistry with Harrison Ford, which, from what I understand, the scene that they played when Kwan was auditioning was the poker scene, which you can really tell they're having fun with that scene. You cheat, Dr. Jones. What's this? I just love that scene. That's my favorite little moment between them. It's kind of ruined by Kate Capshaw going back and forth, screaming at every animal around, as James Ruff said. It's a freaking owl, not a slasher villain. Amish Puri does an excellent job as Molo Ram. I mean, there's not too much depth to his character, but for this type of film, and the performance he gives and the presence he has, especially in his first scene, which is the aforementioned heart scene, he does an excellent job. You really want to see Indy kick his ass. While they don't have a good, fight scene like he did with the giant German in the first film and then with the giant thuggy here, they do have a nice little confrontation on the hanging bridge, and of course, he gets his faith thrown back at him, my other comment and he does get a fitting ending. Roshan Seth plays the Prime Minister character, and he does a pretty good job as well. He's essentially just there as Mola Ram's second. He does get a fitting ending too, like that wood essentially crushing him. And just how he tries to play it off like, there is no thuggy cult here. You can definitely tell from the first moment you hear him say something along that line, you're like, bullshit. All in all, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is a well-crafted, entertaining film. It is darker than the first one. There are a couple things about it that aren't as well executed, like the romance. I mean, the villains aren't too deep, but they're deep enough for this type of film. The way it handles it, Hindu and Indian culture, could get you to go, okay, this is disrespectful. But for me personally, with how I view it, it's not too bad. And that little thing with Indiana, it's like there's a couple things that could bring it down, but I think it's actually a pretty decent sequel. I would put it in the category of sequel that it's not better than the first film, but it's on par, if not just a little bit lower. I'd say it's at least on par as of this viewing. And it is worthy of the first film. However, of the three, it is not my favorite. That honor, of course, goes to the next entry, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Remember to read your Charlemagne.